Okay, assalamu alaikum, ahlan wa sahlan. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for joining us in this KAUST impact session on hydrogen. So my name is Sarathy. I'm a professor in KAUST, and I teach a course there, Energy 101. And I walk into the lecture hall on the first day of class, and I introduce myself to the students, and one young man in the front raises his hand right away. I said, yes, what is it? He said, I know the answer. I said, I didn't ask any question. He says, yes, but I know the answer. I said, okay, what's the answer? Green hydrogen. It seems like everybody today says the answer for everything is green hydrogen. But is it really the solution, or is this just an illusion? Is there real hype around this, or is it a real promise? So today we want to answer that question. Today we produce about 90 million tons of hydrogen per year, but that hydrogen is coming from hydrocarbons and associated with CO2 emissions. The hydrogen industry is valued at about $130 billion. And that's going to grow with 10% per year for the next 10 years. So we're going to see doublings and triplings in hydrogen production, hydrogen market share over the next 20 years. And at the same time, this hydrogen needs to be low carbon or decarbonized. So the panel today is highly distinguished. I'm very happy to have worked together with the KAUST Sustainability Office, Dr. Ana Margarita Costa and Dr. June Abrahano, to bring this panel to you. And I'd like to introduce them to come take the stage now to talk about the hydrogen economy. Peter Terium, the CEO of ENOWA, the Energy and Water Company of NEOM. Please join us. Mohamed AlBalaihed, the head of energy investments at the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia. Dr. Manal Shehabi, an academic visitor at the University of Oxford and the founding director of Shear Research Advisory Services. And Joy Egbe, a social entrepreneur and climate activist from Nigeria. So I'm going to start by asking some questions just broadly around the second energy transition to each of our panelists. And I'll start with Peter. Peter, in ENOWA, you're aiming to make the region of NEOM 100% renewable energy powered. Why is this ambition so important? Why does it have to be 100%?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Manny. And I need to go back a bit further. I've spent most of my energy career in trying to convert a more than 100-year-old energy system towards renewables. And that's a challenge. I mean, you see I lost most of my hair and I gained a bit of weight. So I thought starting from scratch and doing it right the first time is an easy job. Now, mind you, I've lost the rest of my hair and gained some further weight. But there certainly are choices you can make from the outset, because managing and building and setting up a 100% renewable energy system from scratch allows you to make system choices that you cannot make or that are difficult to change when you have an established system. And that is the opportunity that we have in NEOM. And it fits very well to the vision, the aim of NEOM to build a sustainable society. And that sustainability needs 100% renewable energy, because energy is, or at least was, one of the biggest emitters of carbon dioxide. And it feeds into so many follow-up processes. If you do not start at the core, the rest of your activities will not be sustainable. And that is what we aim to do, and that's what we plan to do in NEOM.
Excellent. And Mohamed, in a similar note, PIF is expanding significantly its energy ventures portfolio. Where do you see it going in the next decade?
Yes, hello everyone. PIF has already started investing heavily when it comes to energy transition and decarbonization. And we intend to do so going forward as well over the next 10 years. Over the past, PIF introduced the Renewable Development Program, where PIF is responsible to execute 70% of the kingdom's renewable capacity. We already started last year by investing in our first 1.5 gigawatt PV plant in Sder. We also established platforms when it comes to energy efficiency, waste management, and we intend to grow those over the next 10 years. PIF also intends to invest in new sectors under the energy umbrella that are targeted towards decarbonization and energy transition. One important to mention is hydrogen. PIF just established a national hydrogen champion with a mandate to enable the kingdom and position KSA as a global hub for hydrogen production. And this will be mainly done through investments in the production of hydrogen, conversion, as well as infrastructure. And hopefully the details of that will be announced early next year. So we're definitely quite bullish on energy transition and decarbonization.
Excellent. And Manal, from a policy and regulatory landscape, which parts of the world do you see are moving the quickest in this energy transition?
From a regulatory perspective.
Well, in implementation, and where do you see most of the action happening? Is it the Middle East, North Africa? Do you see it in Europe?
Hello, everyone. So if you look at just the projects that have been announced, they pretty much cover the whole globe. There's a lot in Australia, a lot in Asia, of course, some in the Middle East. The US has advanced quite a bit. But in terms of, I think, the announced projects are not necessarily in line with where the regulatory and the investments in technology are in. So approximately 20% of the technology investments that are for hydrogen or low carbon technology in general are in Europe. Obviously, Germany is a lead in that as well. Asian countries, Korea, Japan, even China are investing quite heavily in that. The US as well. Obviously, the Middle East with a lead in also Saudi Arabia have announced massive investments, which you've just mentioned with the PIF being interested in investing in that. But there, I think the infrastructure and the regulatory framework are still probably need to catch up to kind of get to the level of the production that is required as well. And obviously Africa, still more, I think Africa is, there's a lot of interest there, both from the North African countries, but also other parts of Africa where there's also massive renewables, definitely for green energy. But again, the infrastructure is slightly lacking, as well as obviously the regulatory framework indeed.
Okay. And coming to Africa, Joy, then, so every year, millions of people are coming out of energy poverty in Africa. And where do you see then the role of solutions like renewable energy and hydrogen becoming enablers for them?
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you for that. It is true that there has been an increase in, energy access in Africa compared to the last 20 or 15 years. But if you look at the numbers clearly, it's a very slow process because we still have more than 600 million people still living in energy poverty, and that is about up to 50% of the entire population of Africa. And the majority of the African countries that are currently going through social and economical crisis, we can actually relate it to the because of energy poverty and lack of access to electricity. So because majority of these countries don't have the means to develop the economy. And coupling with the fact that Africa is one of the most vulnerable regions to climate change, it actually means that we can address the current energy crisis with the traditional method, which is fossil fuel. We need an alternative method, and I believe that that is the opportunities that we have to explore all the various energy options, such as solar, wind, and most especially green hydrogen to transform our economy. Because the big priority should be how do we utilize these energy sources to transit and meet the energy demands of the continent without jeopardizing growth, because most of the Western countries are already growing, and we Africans, we are looking up to that. And I believe that is where hydrogen comes in. It has the potential to transform our energy sectors, and with the resources that we have in Africa, the abundant resources, the solar energy, the wind, hydropower, and everything. I think Africa is really ready in terms of these natural resources for that. But the big question will be does Africa have the capacity, the resources, and the infrastructures? And I believe that's the reason why we're having this conversation, because if that is the future we want, we should be able to invest in it, because the idea, the goal is to leave no one behind, I believe.
We're going to come to that point later on. So hold the thought of hydrogen as a democratizing enabler for energy, and especially in Africa. And I think we're going to have an interesting discussion. But before we get there, if you invest a lot in hydrogen, or you're planning to invest a lot in hydrogen, Mohamed, where do you see then the major demand going to be coming from? And the buyers of your hydrogen here in Saudi Arabia?
I mean, demand is going to come I mean, it's quite broad. It's going to come from a lot of the countries worldwide. But at least for Saudi Arabia, we're going to be focusing a lot on the net importers, so to say, the countries that don't have the required, I would say, renewable capacities in terms of PV radiation and wind efficiency, such as Europe, such as Asia, mainly South Korea and Japan. Those countries will be net importers, and they're going to be a target market for Saudi Arabia. So today we've actually signed an agreement with POSCO and Samsung from Korea to build a large-scale hydrogen plant in KSA that is going to be purely targeted for export to Korea. So these three areas are generally going to be the target markets for Saudi Arabia outside of Saudi. But of course, we intend also to produce for local use as well.
Okay, and speaking of local use, which industries do you think are then going to be the largest demand consumers, Peter?
Yeah, and that adds very well to what Mohamed has said. And what I love about hydrogen is it is not a one-trick pony. There are so many sectors and areas that need this. I mean, it's a feedstock, it's a commodity product for power plants, for heat purposes, it's a consumer product for mobility. And as I always said, we might not get it exactly right in all the demand forecasts in each of those sectors, but the chance that we get it wrong in all of them is also pretty remote. So that development I see coming, and you rightly said, some of the countries that you've mentioned are a net importer because they do not have the national resources, sun and wind and space. Don't forget that one. You need a lot of land to produce solar and wind electricity, and that's just not available in some of the congested areas. And they will have a pull for that. And I see that demand already developing. The first one, which is coming up, is mobility. You know, and within a city, you can drive around with your electric car, and that's all fine. You find a charging point around every corner, if you're lucky. But if you go for long haul, or if you go for heavy-duty transport, that's not available, or it's not economic. So that is where the next breakthrough comes for hydrogen. It's in the heavy-duty mobility arena, including public transport. Because if you have a bus or a whole fleet of buses, you can't put them on a charging point for an hour and a half. They need to be running, day and night. So that's where I see the first demand developing. But pretty soon and quickly following that is steel. And people always have been skeptical because they say steel is such a low-cost commodity and they will need huge investments. They're never going to do that. Mind you, it's not the steel companies that determine this. It's their customers. And if Volkswagen has made the promise that their next Golf is going to be produced out of green steel, and the steel component in a Golf is, I don't know, 250 euros, well, that's a bit more expensive. For Volkswagen, doesn't matter. They will go to the steel factories and say, whatever it takes, you have to produce green steel for me. So I see that pull coming in a lot of countries, the ones that you've mentioned, and there are many other sectors and segments that will be following that. But the main breakthrough, which is at the verge of happening, and I see huge similarities with what happened in PV and in solar. The beginning, people said, yeah, this is just a hobby, it's heavily subsidized, it's been driven by policy. The real breakthrough in the rollout came because, mind my words, and I'm Dutch, so I speak a bit freely, it's just damn cheap. That's why the breakthrough came. And I see the same happening in hydrogen. With the cost of renewables coming down to the level that we're currently at, with the cost of the electrolyzers coming down, with infrastructure being brought in place, just the green hydrogen is going to be a very competitive proposition in the midterm and in the long term. And that's my belief.
So countries are buying it to decarbonize their economies, many industrial sectors. And in Africa, is there already some uptake of hydrogen, Joy? And do you see consumers adopting it?
Yes. Africa has been utilizing hydrogen in different sectors for many decades, but you see the current conversation and this debate on green hydrogen mostly is driven by the fact that Africa wants to meet the energy needs of the people and also the urgency to cut down emission and meet the climate target by 2030. There are some projects currently going on in Africa. We have some of them are in feasibility and planning stage, and others are in their early development. For the early development stages ones are the Namibia, Angola, and we also have some South Africa, Egypt, and Morocco, who are still going through planning stages. And the fact that a majority of European countries are looking into Africa as their potential suppliers of hydrogen, actually driving the hydrogen conversation and visibility in Africa. And I believe that with the success and visibility that these current projects ongoing in Africa are getting, it's a matter of time before other African countries start coming up with their own strategic plans and policy that can support the utilization and market for hydrogen. And with the current world global energy crisis that is currently going on, and many developing nations are looking for alternative energy source, and many of them are in conversation and engagement with African countries in terms of green hydrogen supply and production. I think it's really driving the African market, and I believe the conversation in terms of green hydrogen is going to keep growing and increasing, provided that we have the necessary facility to do that.
Okay. So Manal, just to wrap this up, is this all hype, or do you think there's real promise in all this?
It is indeed a hype, and there is also huge promise for a real hydrogen revolution, but we're not there yet to actually achieve that. I think often when we hear the talk of hydrogen, we kind of, it's often presented as kind of the silver bullet and the solution, and that's probably not going to be the case. It will be one important solution as part of a larger suite of solutions, but in and of itself, it might not be. And even if we look at even the very optimistic estimates of the share of hydrogen that's going to be in the energy transition, it's probably going to be anywhere from 12% to 22% within 2050. So this is a really large range, and that's going to depend on the investments that are going to be put on the ground. It's going to be also on who's going to be the demand and the uptakers that will be using that, and where we get the balance of is where, because not even though hydrogen has a lot of usages in different industries, it makes more sense in some industries like steel or even cement rather than other industries that might be very low scale, and maybe the efficiency there, the input of energy is a lot higher than what we'll be getting out. So I think there's a lot of, and going back to the question earlier about the infrastructure, I think with, we see over between $400 to $600 billion now worth of projects globally of hydrogen. So I think there's definitely investments and advancements in technology, but for us to reach that potential that hydrogen can reach, there's still, or it promises to reach, there's still a way for us to meet that.
So there's barriers. We need to overcome these barriers.
Absolutely.
And maybe let's talk about what those barriers may be. They could be infrastructure, they could be technology, they could be investments, they could be policy and regulation. So let's think about technology. Do you think technology is really a barrier towards the hydrogen economy today, Peter?
Yeah, well, I'll say something about that, but I first would like to come back to the hype, because I'm not in the fashion or in the hype industry. It's not a hype, it's a paradigm shift. And that's very similar, but very different. And why it's a paradigm shift? Because we went into renewable energy to decarbonize the power generation. But if you look at all of the energy used in the world, only roughly 20% is used in the form of electric energy. And even if you would double the use of electric energy by saying electric cars or electrifying whatever you can, it would still be 40% only of your total energy need. So what are we going to do about the other 60 to 80%? And that is where hydrogen is the only medium that can, on a long term, really sustainably decarbonize all of the other energy factors. And that's the paradigm shift. And I call it the second wave of the energy transition. And it comes logically, because the first wave came by cost of wind and solar coming down. Yeah? Look at solar in this region, $0.50 a kilowatt hour. You cannot even burn cheap gas at that price, you know, sorry to say that, but that is where it comes from. And that drives that second wave. That's the paradigm shift. And it's about to happen. And the first signals are there, and I'm fully with you that it is still a long way to go, but it also took quite a long way to get to the renewable energy penetration we currently have. But that way is unavoidable, and we've embarked upon it. And I think Saudi plays a central role, because what do you need for that? You need a lot of sun, which they have. You need some wind, which they have as well. You need a lot of space. You need a geographic location that can allow you to serve markets like Europe or Southeast Asia or Africa. And you need an infrastructure play. And if there's something that Saudi is good at, it is building large infrastructures. So I think that's a spot on. And just sorry to come back on your hype question, but I see this as a paradigm shift. Yeah? And what are the barriers? Because we're not there yet, as I said. Yeah, and what is holding us back? You know, part of it is a catch-22. We need to get to scale because infrastructure you cannot build for just 2 trucks in Schwarzwald in Germany. Yeah, it needs a large scale in order to build pipelines, in order to build liquefaction terminals, to get the shipping fleet in place, etc. That is a real issue, but that will be done. You know, I know a lot of German engineers, but now I know a lot of Saudi engineers. I admire them. They will get it solved as long as there is the policy that needs to be set for that. Policy not in the sense of subsidy, but in the sense of rulemaking. We need a consistency in the approach, in the European Union, but also in other markets. What qualifies as green hydrogen? Under what conditions can we produce it and deliver it? And it needs to support the political support to build these infrastructures, because a pipeline in Saudi can be controlled easily here, but then there's a few other jurisdictions that you need to go through, including the Mediterranean, and that's the policy support that you really need on that. I think on the technology side, I'm pretty relaxed. We see things happening similar to solar, and they will just come.
Okay. See, I often say hydrogen is one of the most democratic molecules. You have all the colors of hydrogen, an entire rainbow of colors. So blue, green, gray, white, turquoise, pink. That's my favorite one. And all of these colors of hydrogen, they need an infrastructure. And I know we're here to talk about green hydrogen, but Mohamed, what do you think Saudi Arabia can do, its partner countries can do to actually build this infrastructure for all the colors of hydrogen?
Thank you. I don't know about all the colors of hydrogen. I mean, we're quite bullish on green hydrogen and on blue hydrogen, because I think KSA is well positioned to do that, be it through the hydrocarbon sector or through what Peter mentioned, that we have all the enablers, be it the low-cost PV, wind, and also the lands. PIF is also has the capital needs to invest in infrastructure, and I think this is going to be one of the main targets we do. I mean, investing in pipelines, be it in country, or even investing in transportation means cross-country. I mean, today, hydrogen is being transported, or the molecules are being transported mainly through ammonia as a means of transport. And I think this is one of the bottlenecks we'll probably need to solve for. How can we transport hydrogen more efficiently and less costly? So this is one of the areas I think KSA and the world in general is going to be looking into, investing in, and exploring new ways to make it more efficient, cost-wise, and from a logistics perspective. Other areas is also the technology itself. I mean, electrolyzers. We think today there is a supply chain glut, at least in the whole economy, given the huge demands we see. But we don't see this as a huge risk. We believe over the medium term, huge investments are going to be made in expanding the scale and capacities of these electrolyzers, and hopefully these are going to be the main areas I think PIF and the main producers are going to be investing in to really enable the sector and increase production, so to say.
Well, what is it going to take to get a pipeline from Saudi Arabia to Europe?
Well, that's a very complex question, and we don't know honestly by today if it's doable or not, but it's definitely something we're willing to put the resources, the time and effort to explore. And I think if Saudi was able to build a pipeline from here to Europe, I think this is going to be a complete game changer for Saudi in terms of the potential of satisfying the needs in Europe when it comes to low carbon hydrogen.
Any thoughts there? Manal, what it would take to actually build a large-scale infrastructure to deliver hydrogen from Middle East to North Africa to Europe? You think it's a policy challenge? Is it an infrastructure challenge?
It's a bit of both. I think it's definitely a policy challenge, because policy, a lot of the time, it's really going to be the policy that will dictate where the projects will be and what the policies will be. There's also funding, where the funding is going to be coming from, because also, again, having uptakers, so if a country in Europe wants to also have the production from, let's say, North Africa that you mentioned, then they probably will be more interested in having the infrastructure. But also it comes down also to the location and the type of hydrogen. So if you look at the type of hydrogen that will be exported from, for example, what Aramco shipped to Japan, it was blue ammonia, and that makes sense because of the infrastructure that exists. So sometimes the building the infrastructure, it's not just a cost situation and a policy, but also depends on what it is that you're producing and how, who's going to be also buying it. Does it make sense to ship it in pipelines, or is it better to not and basically ship a derivative? And I want to go back to maybe relative to that a little bit, the point on the technology, because you said you're not worried about technology, and I think there will be investments in technology, but we're not there yet again. I think whether we're looking at green, for electrolyzers, there's still a lot of, not all the technology for electrolyzers has reached maturity, and also for blue hydrogen, which, like in the case of Saudi Arabia, blue and green are the favorable options. With blue, we also need carbon technology and solutions to not just reduce the cost, but also really also reduce the carbon content, so that the blue hydrogen can then also become competitive as clean hydrogen. So I think there's, I think once we, with policy going back, if the policy incentivizes or perhaps mandates certain demand, such as in the UK, where there is clear industrialization policy of how hydrogen will be used in different industries, then that will give also signals to the market and to investors and to technology investors to then dedicate more efforts and resources into these technology paths, which will then expedite both the production and the uptake of hydrogen in both or multitudes of colors that you've mentioned at the beginning.
So we're talking here about humanity and investing in humanity and hydrogen potentially for humanity. But we heard it's where the sun is, it's where the wind is, and these are typically in areas that are abundant in renewable energy, but the consumers are the global north. So does hydrogen just become another form of energy colonization? How do we prevent that? Any thoughts there, Joy?
Yes. Of course, we've talked about and we've seen a lot of conversation on the size of Africa and all the abundant natural resources that we have that it's very ideal for hydrogen production in Africa. But the main question is that we need a new environment, we need a lot of things, and I've heard a lot of emphasis on the framework and regulatory policies. Just like every other nations and Africa and countries, Africa needs to have an enable environment that supports the utilization and production of hydrogen. But most especially, I think for us to make sure that hydrogen, the green hydrogen produced in Africa, it's meant for the people within the country, within the continent, not a political ambition or a business ambition, just like we have the fossil fuel, which you can say like majority of African countries, or for my own country, Nigeria, we are one of the major oil producer and exporters, but we are still living in energy poverty. So it's not really addressing the problem. It's not really accommodating the people. So I believe that these are some issues, and for green hydrogen, we must address some barriers to make sure that the projects or the green hydrogen economy is benefiting the people, not whoever wants it to benefit them. And I think one of the things we have to look into is capacity. In as much as we are advocating for frameworks and regulations, I also believe that if we don't have the capacity, having the framework is one thing, but having the ability to make sure it works is another thing, and it's a different thing entirely. So we need to invest in our own capacity to make sure that inward and locally we can operate and maintain this project ourselves without depending on the outside world in terms of maybe the global north or developing nation. And one other thing I think is that we're talking about technology and for green hydrogen. I believe that Africa should be able to pay more attention and investment into developing or manufacturing our own technologies for green hydrogen, like electrolyzers. We have platinum and natural resources that we can use to do that. So if we can, because now hydrogen is currently expensive, importing everything into Africa, then producing the green hydrogen then to export out. That's expensive and waste of resources. So we should be able to do some of the things locally ourselves to make sure we cut down cost and we make it more accessible to people. And also, it's a way of building our own workforce and manpower in terms of green hydrogen production for the future. And one other thing I believe is that I see a lot of the hydrogen projects currently going on in Africa. It's majorly private government partnership and investment. I also believe if we can, maybe investors can look into also investing in people. I mean, researchers and innovators that are working on maybe hydrogen research. It's also a way of building capacity. When I say investment, I don't mean like, I mean maybe grants to support research works. With that, I think we'll be able to build the African green hydrogen ecosystems. So.
Any other thoughts, Peter, about localization for the hydrogen economy, making it more...
Well, let me put one important, I wouldn't call it a disclaimer, but just to keep all things in perspective, it's not an either or. You know, when we talk about, start with the color spectrum, you know, and of course I'm advocating the green hydrogen because we don't have any oil in NEOM or don't want to explore it. But the world will need all variations of color. I mean, the challenge ahead of us and the investment and the capacity needed is such that all colors will be needed in order to decarbonize. And whether you take out 100% or 80% of the carbon, you know, you can debate about the 20%, but you should debate about the 80 that you get achieved. So I think all colors will play a role, and that's the strength of Saudi, that they can offer the full spectrum of that. Having said that, the second element, just to keep it in perspective, it's not either or in the sense of will it be produced all in Saudi? Preferably yes, but most likely no. Yeah, we will see in Europe decentral, local manufacturing of green hydrogen. That makes sense. There where you have wind and there where you have space, you serve or you avoid the transport, but it will not be enough. And that is the beauty of this, that the central and global supplies will fit in with local supplies to complement it. And if that local supply is strong enough, competitive enough, like for instance in Africa, then they might not need any imports. Whereas other areas, like the ones that you've mentioned, Mohamed, Korea, Japan, Europe, they just don't have sufficient resources and they have a need which way goes above what they can produce. They will need to look at other markets where this can be produced so cheap that you can avoid the transport, or that you can afford the transport. Now, and therefore, like always, complex problems are best being solved by many, many solutions adding up to the totality. Mm-hmm. And that is where I see, you know, you call it democratization, but, you know, it's a trend that we see in many other things as well, whether it is mobile communication, whether it is energy production, or whether it is hydrogen as a form of energy. That's just going to happen, and it will give countries like regions like Africa and many others chances that they currently haven't had.
Yes, please, Manal.
Thank you. I think the point on whether it's democratizing energy or not, I think is really important because also of the direction, and building on what you said with the example of Nigeria or Africa, I mean, a lot of the countries that are looking to invest in hydrogen projects really are still energy poor, precisely, not just in Nigeria. I mean, look at Namibia, for example, or even in the Gulf region, where we're not energy poor in the real sense of the word, but the expansion of renewable energy or the adoption of renewable energy is still low compared to the region's amazing capacity and also compared to the region's targets. So then this is where it becomes a question of, are we then building all of this renewable infrastructure, for example, just to build green hydrogen, or then are we also allowing that to really translate to benefits for the regions that are looking to invest in green hydrogen as well? And then of course there's a second element of then what do you do with the produced hydrogen? Can you use it domestically for local decarbonization, or do you just export it? But we need to also remember that the cost might be really high. So it might end up being that the only variable or economic option would be to export it. And in that case, then is there really going to be a benefit for a lot of the countries that will be producing? And that there will really lie a big part of the question of, then that could be, the question of, is it colonialization or not? So I think in terms of investments, there should be some sort of, especially from foreign investments to places where there is still energy poverty, really some sort of a commitment then to ensure that these, at a minimum, energy poverty is addressed there for one. But then I think that the other part then beyond that would be, how do you make sure, as a policymaker, how do policymakers then make sure that the benefits that would come from revenue of hydrogen exports then translate to development for the rest of the economy? Because there's many countries where there was, development of oil and gas resources or mining, and a lot of that funds did not really translate to development. So the critical thing here would be to capture the capability or the potential possibility of the hydrogen investments to then also translate to funds to governments and then could support economic development. So it's a bit more complex than just democracy or not.
So I see around the room many leading executives from industries, governments, and agencies. I know you have burning hydrogen questions, so I want you to ask them. Okay, I don't want you to feel shy. I want you to stand up. I can bring you the mic, or you can raise your voice. And we will address your questions. Why not? Yes, Yusuf.
I don't know if you heard me before. So the panel spoke about different obstacles and opportunities for green hydrogen. And I didn't hear anything about the problem of intermittency of hydrogen with regards to the weather. For example, the production of hydrogen in Saudi Arabia will not the same as in Botswana or South Africa or Morocco or Chile or whatever. So maybe this question is for Peter.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the question. I think specifically hydrogen is a great breakthrough for the issue of intermittency, because you can produce it and you can store it. Yeah, and I know the storage is not fully developed in all its aspects, but it can be done. And then specifically if you use pipelines are the most effective form of storage for hydrogen. By just varying the pressure from 20 bar to 60 bar, you have a huge storage potential. So that is great, and therefore, and I don't want to get into too much of a techno-economic discussion, but the first stepping stone for hydrogen was wind and solar, and specifically NEOM. I found a pot of gold in NEOM because we have top 5 highest irradiation. It's not sunshine, it's irradiation that matters. And that's top 5 in the world, but we also have top 5 onshore wind profiles. And that combination is very unique because the profile we have in NEOM gives us wind mainly in the evening and the night. Oh wow, that's exactly when we have no sun. So it's very complementary, and that helped us to start, embark upon the first large-scale green hydrogen factory to be built. The next wave, what I see with the cost of electrolyzers coming down, and specifically electrolyzers becoming more flexible, there's a second breakover point, which is, I call it PV only. Because wind, with all its respect and how cheap it is, it will never achieve the specific costs of solar. So if the cost of electrolyzer comes down significantly, I'm talking 10-20%, I'm talking 40, 60, 70%, then there's a next tipping point where putting your electrolyzer next to your solar field is more cheaper than running it double the time and using wind as well. And this has to do with the conversion that you need to do, transporting the electricity over high voltage and the transfer stations that you need for that, which are very expensive. So that's the second tipping point that I see coming, probably in the next 5 years. And that is what brings the cost of hydrogen down, and then your intermittency is not an issue anymore, because you can store it either in tanks, or you liquefy it, or you put it in a pipeline, and then you vary the pressure, and then you have your continuous supply that you need.
Very good. We have a question here.
Thanks very much. Ian Halliday from the Australian Trade Investment Commission. Just a question for an esteemed guest from PIF about the investment side, because Australia is going to be a major investor in hydrogen, and we've already announced that we've got about 7 hydrogen hubs all around the country. And I was just curious about, from a technological development perspective, about the opportunities for co-investment across the globe to help accelerate the technological development. So certainly around renewables and what it leads then to hydrogen.
Yeah, I think, so the question is focused on the technology side of hydrogen, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. Yes, I think, I mean, as from PIF side and KSA side, I think we want to definitely play a role in the development of technology, be it on the PV side or even on the electrolyzer side. And this is definitely falls under the mandate of the hydrogen company I've mentioned. It's investing in these technologies, be it abroad or locally. But I think if the scale picks up in KSA over the next year or two in terms of building large-scale projects, I think at that time it's going to be quite opportune for us to localize these technologies in KSA through partnerships with the well-known, I would say, electrolyzer producers abroad. And we also want to have a role on the R&D side. So I think when it comes to technology development, R&D, be it on the PV side or even the electrolyzer side, beyond intending to invest and increase capacities for KSA and the region, we also intend to invest in the R&D side and have a role in developing these technologies that KSA and other countries can benefit from. And all of that will be done, of course, through co-investments and partnerships with other companies from abroad.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Al Collier, representing Reaction Global. We've talked a lot about green hydrogen in terms of a basic commodity and the basic infrastructure to deliver that at scale. Is there also an opportunity for higher value-added products to be built on that infrastructure? You know, similar to oil, you can make many higher value-added products on the basic commodity. Is that fairly straightforward also when it comes to hydrogen?
Maybe I think it's a good one for Peter, some of the value-added products, but then I'll also pass it over to Manal.
Yeah, I mean, it's not fully my remit, but I'm happy to, I have an opinion about it, so like I have about many things. Certainly, and we see this, and I'm talking as an outsider, well, not informed outsider, if I might call it like that, being 4 years in Saudi now. And what is happening in Saudi is strategically very smart. I mean, there's this expression which says the end of the Stone Age didn't happen because we run out of stone. Yeah, the end of the hydrocarbon age will not happen because we run out of hydrocarbon, and it will not happen overnight. I always say we still use stones to build houses, and that is what we will see in hydrocarbons. You know, I always say such a beautiful product, it's a pity to burn it to make something cheap like electricity or movement. There's so many valuable applications of oil, petrochemical industry, high-performance plastics, which the world will need for quite some long time. And what you see what has happened in the last decade or even longer is Saudi moved into petrochemicals. Look at SABIC, where they are right now. Look at what Aramco does. And it frees up oil that is not needed anymore. And I think that's the complementary development. And something similar I would encourage to happen on the basis of hydrogen. Why would you produce hydrogen and ship it all to Europe so they can make beautiful products out of it? And why not using it to decarbonize Yanbu or other areas and ship them the higher value products that they are asking for rather than let them make it themselves? And I think that's what you call global competition. You know, we will see where the technology sits, where the investments sit, and where the logistical advantages are. And I can only say I would not be surprised if that trend will also be followed in hydrogen like it has embarked upon in petrochemical.
Manal, want to add something there?
Thank you. I think that's a great question because it also goes into one of the things that would probably, if we find these high value investments, then would also drive really the investment and the demand in hydrogen. But unlike oil and gas, where it's also an energy source in and of itself, hydrogen is a carrier, right? So then also the usages, and I think the main, the golden mine, so to speak, of hydrogen is really its applicability in decarbonizing what we call hard-to-abate sectors, these large sectors, whether it's cement or steel or others. And I think even, and the usage of hydrogen is actually not new. Like NASA has been using it since the 60s, right? So there's a lot of applications where hydrogen could be used. But if we're thinking about the clean hydrogen, so more the lower carbon type hydrogen, I think hydrogen itself isn't going to be beyond, ammonia or in transportation applications. I think the real big thing where a lot of the value would be is in these really large sectors where hydrogen can then be a way to decarbonize these industries that cannot be decarbonized through electricity and batteries.
My name is Ahmed. I am from Oman. I just want to know, where do the banks stand as far as financing this project? Do they take, like conventional, project finance, or they rely on the balance sheet of the developer? Are banks brave enough for the first wave of the projects, that's happening? We don't see banks talking about, where they stand.
So I know Peter has a lot of experience in the financing aspect, but maybe first, Mohamed, do you have any thoughts there on the financing aspect for these very large projects related to hydrogen?
Yeah, probably, I mean, I'll probably hand it over also to Peter because they're working on an actual project in NEOM, so he might have actual experience. But definitely, I think hydrogen, nowadays it's a nascent sector, it's considered quite risky, and we would expect banks would, at least in the beginning, or some of the banks would shy away from investing. But one of the things we see a lot is also the government-supported financing agencies are playing quite a significant role, and I think they would be, so to say, an initial mediator that will enable the development of the first phase of projects, and I would assume NEOM project is taking full advantage of that. So I think government should probably replace banks in the initial years, should the financing not be there. But eventually, I think once projects get developed, it gets de-risked, I think you would see banks quite active in financing these projects.
Yeah, I'm sorry if I take too much airtime, but I'm happy to add to that. And the answer is pretty simple. There's a lot of money in the world that looks specifically for green investment. So if I take, for instance, our joint venture project, which is a joint venture with Aqua Power and Air Products, and NEOM is in with 1/3, so we do not have the majority, we're just a minority shareholder in that. Now, given that it is a joint venture, you finance it on the balance sheet. And we went out, and I can only say that the interest in the market was huge. It was oversubscribed, and this has to do with the fact that A, it is green, and B, the technology is not that, adventurous. I know there's a lot of work to be done on the cost of the electrolyzers, etc., but it's not like flying to the moon or flying to Mars. This is technology that is used in chlorine electrolyzers. So basically, the risk is rather limited. So banks say, affordable risk, fully green profile, can I have more of that?
Okay, last question. It's going to be a fast one.
I'm Amar Khashoggi from AMCAS Group, and I will keep it very short. The hydrogen economy, I'd like to investigate with the panel how the structure will be to accommodate SMEs. Is there a role for SMEs to play here? Thank you.
Manal.
So I assume you're talking of a country like Saudi Arabia, correct? So I think the oil industry is obviously national, and the hydrogen economy will have a slightly different structure where it's not going to be completely controlled, I think, in my opinion, only by a national oil company or national energy companies, let's call them. But I really think for that to really kick off, particularly if we want to expand in investments in technology, in uptake, in also access for labor market opportunities, then the SMEs would really have to be involved, but that also requires a regulatory change in the structure of the energy or the hydrogen project, so that it slightly is a different structure, so to speak, to allow the SMEs to participate, especially when we have, for example, in the NEOM project, there is also investments and participation from foreign companies. So there should be a role for SMEs not only on the technology front and the construction front, but also in the uptake, and I think that should be a dialogue, because they will really be, for the hydrogen economy at the broader sense, to be important and to translate those benefits I mentioned before to the people. Really, SMEs' role will have to be really capitalized on, and it is not to be understated at all.
Okay, so I'd like to thank you all for your attention, your engagement, the audience, panelists. It was a great discussion, and let's keep the hydrogen hype going. Okay.